Welcome back to Essential Foundations Analytic Idealism Course. In the last part 6, we've discussed the critical difference there is between what in analytic philosophy is called phenomenal consciousness or pure experience and metaconsciousness, which entails a higher level mental function, metacognitive awareness, the ability to not only experience, as in phenomenal consciousness, but also to know that one is experiencing. So metaconsciousness is a subset of phenomenal consciousness. And understanding this distinction allows us to see why the so-called unconscious of depth psychology has a place in analytic idealism. Namely, the so-called unconscious is simply phenomenal consciousness that is not metaconscious or which is dissociated from a certain center of awareness. Now, in this part 7, which is the very last part of this course, we are closing it today, I'm going to explicitly respond to a few of the more interesting objections against analytic idealism, except one which is not interesting at all. It's question-begging on the face of it, but I will respond to it because it has been made, it's a criticism that has been made by a very visible person, namely Jerry Coyne. So I feel sort of obliged to to give an otherwise completely unnecessary response to a criticism that on the face of it is silly. Anyway, let's get started. It's one objection per slide, and I'm going to answer it verbally. Most of the hardcore content of my answers, the papers that I will be referring to, most of it has already been listed in previous parts, in previous modules. So I'm not going to repeat all that and list all that in the description of this video, because otherwise it would become an enormous description. I would have to copy and paste everything that I have already posted in the description of other videos. But if there is something unique that I haven't linked to before, then I will list that in the description below. All right, the first objection is a very intuitive one. It's one of the historical objections against idealism, and that's the idea that, look, I can kick a stone and it will hurt my feet. So idealism is not true because the world has concreteness. The world is very concrete, and therefore something that is so concrete, like a stone that I can't kick, or if I kick it will hurt my toes, that cannot be mental. Well, to see the fallacy behind this objection, just keep in mind that concreteness is a mental quality. When we kick a stone and it hurts our toes, that hurt, that pain, is a mental quality. The solidity of the stone is a mental quality. So concreteness, solidity, pain, immovability, these are experiential qualities. If you could go ahead and kick the stone in the absence of all qualities, which would be the real world of mainstream physicalism, then there would be no pain, there would be no concreteness, there would be just mathematical relations across abstract quantities. So this objection, actually, if correctly interpreted, reinforces analytic idealism. It reinforces that reality is actually mental. When you kick a stone, it hurts. You feel the concreteness of the stone. These are mental qualities that unfold in our consciousnesses. Next objection, that's the private mind's objection. And the idea is, okay, if all is in one universal mind, how is it that I can't read your thoughts, feel your feelings, or know what's going on in China? Well, we've answered this ad nauseum in part 4. The idea here is to use the concept of dissociation, which is an empirical reality. We know dissociation happens in nature. We know dissociation can literally be blinding a person with a dissociated alter that cannot see. becomes literally blind, in the sense that there is no brain activity in the visual cortex of this person, even though the person's eyes are open and stuff is happening in front of the person. And nothing's wrong physiologically with the retina, with the optic nerve, nothing. And if the host personality comes back to executive control, then brain activity returns in the visual cortex. So look, there is this thing called dissociation in nature that we know is there, and it is capable of making a person unable to see the world right before the person's eyes, even though the person's eyes are open and fully working. That is the power of dissociation. It can prevent you from seeing what's right in front of you with your eyes open. Is it then a surprise that it prevents me from reading your thoughts or knowing what's going on in China? I don't think it is. Moreover, dissociation and dissociated alters can interact with one another visually, in terms of touch, within the mind of the dissociated person. And that we've seen from research done at Harvard Medical School, and clinical research. So it's entirely analogous to what I propose is happening right now. We are dissociated alters of a spatially unbound field of subjectivity, and we can interact with each other and even touch each other within the context of this spatially unbound mind. So that's the answer to this. The answer to this objection is the core of analytic idealism. Now, the standalone world objection, also a very historical one already used against Bishop Berkeley. If all there is consciousness, does the world continue to exist when not consciously observed by a living being? Does the tree fall in the forest if there is no one there to hear it? Now, the answer is a little bit more nuanced. Yes, the world as it is in itself, the world that surrounds us, that world, as it is in itself, continues to be irrespective of whether there is any living being around to observe it or not. But what we call the physical world, which is not the world as it is in itself, remember, the physical world is how the world is displayed on our dashboard of dials, how it is displayed on the screen of perception. That's what we call the physical world. And it is, of course, attached to an observer. An observer, a dissociated alter, is the entity, the agent that has the dashboard. So if there is no one around to look at the world, then there will be no physical world, in the sense that there will be no dials to measure what's going on in the world as it is in itself, which is not physical. You see the point? So the physical world is not going to be if there is no one looking, because the physical world is what's measured by the dashboard of dials. If the dials are not measuring anything, if there are no dials, then there is by definition no physical world. But the thing measured, the world as it is in itself, continues to exist regardless of whether it's being measured or not. All right, next one. This is going to be a short episode because we basically already talked about all this at different parts. The autonomy of nature objection. If nature is in consciousness, shouldn't I be able to change it merely by imagining it to be different? Well, no, because nature is in consciousness, but it's not in your individual personal consciousness alone. That's the difference. You see, nature is in an extended form and a transpersonal form of natural consciousness, an extended, natural, transpersonal field of subjectivity. But you and I are dissociated alters in that field, and because we are dissociated, our wishes, our whims, desires, fantasies, they are within, they are encompassed by our respective dissociative boundaries, and they cannot influence the rest of nature. Because the rest of nature, again, is not in your alter alone. It's not in my alter alone. The rest of nature is in an extended form of subjectivity beyond the boundaries of our respective alters. That's why we cannot change nature simply by imagining it to be different. Next one, the shared world objection. If all reality is in consciousness, then the world is akin to a dream. More or less, but let's continue. As such, idealism implies that we are all partaking in roughly the same dream. Yet, since our bodies are separate, we cannot be sharing a dream. No, there are a load of things wrong with this. Let's unpack this, starting with the first statement. If all reality is in consciousness, then the world is akin to a dream. Yeah, sort of, metaphorically, but not in the way the objection seems to imply here. We are not dreaming up the outside world in the sense that there is something in nature broadcasting the same dream to every alter. That's not what's going on. What's going on is that the alters are immersed in a mental context, an ocean of transpersonal mentation. And that mental content, that mental world, that mental context, presents itself to our observation on our dashboard of dials as we call the physical world. And therefore, we report on the physical world in mutually consistent ways, because we are indeed immersed in the same world, a world of mentation. But that's not quite exactly the same as a collective dream. What is collective here is the actual world in which we are immersed. You see what I mean? We are not independently hallucinating an outside world that doesn't exist. In other words, sharing some kind of dream without an external context. We are not, according to what's suggested by this objection, we don't need to be sharing a world, an external world. We only need to be sharing a dream, a sort of internal hallucination of a world. The point I'm trying to make is that that's not what's happening. We are sharing an external world, a mental, transpersonal, external world. And that's why we report on the world in mutually consistent ways. See the point? So yes, it's akin to a dream, loosely spoken. I have used this metaphor myself before, but in the context of how this objection is framed, I would say, no, in this context, this is wrong. It's not akin to a dream in this way. It's not like we are all isolated in pods connected to the matrix and hallucinating the same external world, but in fact there is no such external world. No. There is an external world, and it is mental. That's the point. But anyway, let's just concede this, having made this disclaimer. Let's just interpret this sort of more metaphorically, more loosely. Yeah, we are sharing a kind of dream. Yeah, all right, okay. As such, idealism implies that we are all partaking in roughly the same dream. Yeah, it's the same dream because we are actually sharing the same mental world. Yeah, okay. Yet, since our bodies are separate, we cannot be sharing a dream. Now, here it goes wrong. The fact that our bodies are or seem to be separate on the screen of perception, on the dashboard, doesn't entail or imply that our minds are separate. The body is a representation on the dashboard. Separation on the spatial-temporal context of the dashboard does not imply a fundamental separation between individual minds. As we've discussed throughout this course, we are dissociated alters of the same field of subjectivity in nature. Now, alters seem to be separate, but they are not fundamentally separate. The proof of it is that a person with dissociative identity disorder can be cured. And when the person is cured, all the alters are reintegrated, and the host personality can remember being each one of the alters. So this proves conclusively that dissociation does not entail a fundamental separation of minds. It's an illusory, experiential-like separation, in the sense that alters cannot access each other's memories, cannot inferentially access each other's contents of consciousness. So the fact that bodies are, rather fundamentally separate in space-time on the screen of perception, on the dashboard of dials, does not imply that that which is represented by a body is fundamentally separate. See the point? We cannot take an artifact of the screen to be the fundamental reality underlying the screen. I can be looking at an image on television that's suffering from lens flare all over the place and makes the image blurry and oversaturated. That doesn't mean that what's actually happening in the world is distorted by lens flare. Lens flare is an artifact of the camera, of the sensor, which passes on to the dashboard. If you're looking at the output of the camera on a display on the dashboard, that doesn't mean that the world as it is in itself has that same lens flare artifact. It doesn't. Anyway, I hope this point is clarified. Let's go to the next one. The natural order objection, and that objection goes as follows. How plausible is it that the order and stability we discern in the laws of nature represent thoughts and emotions in universal consciousness? Now, the intuitive motivation for this is the following. Our thoughts and emotions tend to be very disorderly and reactive. Depends on whims, on the mood of the day, on circumstances, and we can lose our minds, as we say. So if that characteristic is understood to be a characteristic of all possible mentation, then it's hard to understand how the laws of nature can be so reliable, so regular, so stable, so predictable, because if nature, the universe, is the extrinsic appearance of a mind, and that mind is also sort of reactive and unstable, like ours, like our minds are, then the laws of physics should reflect that, but they don't. So what's the error here? The error here is anthropomorphization. To say that the whole of nature is underlied by a spatially unbound field of awareness, of consciousness, of phenomenality, doesn't entail or imply that the mental characteristics of that field are the same as our mental characteristics. Because we, as alters, have evolved over 3.5 billion years in the context of a planetary ecosystem with the pressures of natural selection. We have had to survive. So our mental characteristics have evolved as a consequence of these 3.5 billion years of evolution. They are a response to the circumstances that we have faced in the course of these 3.5 billion years. But mind at large, the mind, the transpersonal mind underlying nature, has undergone no such pressures. It didn't evolve. It doesn't have to survive in the context of a planetary ecosystem to maintain its unity. It doesn't do any of that. It probably doesn't have any higher order mental functions, like the ability to deliberate, to reflect, to ruminate. Why? Because these are things we know we have evolved in the context of evolution by natural selection at great cost over a very long period of time, 3.5 billion years. So if it has cost nature so much to equip us with these higher level mental functions, why should we think that those higher level mental functions were already there from the beginning at the foundation level of nature? That seems to me very, very unlikely. Otherwise, even an amoeba would have higher level mental functions. A paramecium would have higher level mental functions. That is not the case. So we cannot attribute all these particular characteristics, this reactiveness, this instability of our own mentation to mind at large, because there is no reason to think that mind at large would have the same characteristics. It's a completely different context. The only thing we are saying when we say that mind at large is mental like we are, is that it is experiential in nature. It is a subject of experience. That's all. By saying that, we are not implying or entailing that any of these other mental characteristics that we happen to have because we are human beings on planet Earth necessarily need to be there present in the foundational level of nature. Actually, we have every reason to believe that it should not be. Otherwise, we would have had these mental characteristics from the beginning, which we don't. Anyway, so let's just guard against the risk of anthropomorphizing the whole of nature. Now, when we say that nature is mental just like we are, that's all we are saying. Now, pay attention to what we are then not saying. We are not saying that nature has higher level mental functions, that nature is reactive, that nature is emotional, has fear and despair, it has existential questions. This is too much. It's too much. Analytic idealism calls for none of this. All that you need to accept to exist in nature at large is subjectivity, pure, raw subjectivity. So the fact that the laws of nature are so predictable and regular suggests to me, at least, that the mind underlying nature is a largely instinctive mind, not deliberate, no higher level, higher order mental functions, none of that. It's purely instinctive. Why? Why do I say that? Because instinct is very regular. Instinct is very predictable, stable. It doesn't change. I mean, you can tell what distance you have to stay away from a crocodile for the crocodile not to lunge at you, not to try to catch you, because instinct gives the crocodile one clear and precise answer. That's the distance that you have to be at from your desired prey before you try to catch your prey. Instinctive reactions are very predictable. They're very stable and predictable, just like the laws of nature. All right, next question. The equivalence objection. I have heard this in real life. The notion of a mental world outside personal psyches, personal minds, is equivalent to the physicalist postulate of a world outside consciousness. So the idea here is that, okay, maybe I am right, but at the end of the day, it boils down all to the same thing. There is a world outside, whether it's mental or material, doesn't matter. Well, does it not matter? I think it matters a lot. Let me give you one very big example that it matters. If materialism is right and the outside world is material, and therefore we are material as well, when we die, our consciousness is gone, disappears. Our subjectivity disappears because it's supposed to be a side effect of the particular organization of materials that we call a metabolizing nervous system. When that particular organization is not there anymore, then of course its side effect is gone, subjectivity is gone. But if the outside world is really mental, and therefore we are inherently mental, physicality is only how our mentality presents itself to the screen of perception, to observation from across our dissociative boundaries, and then death is the end of our dissociation. Life is a dissociative process that looks like a living body, and death, the end of life, is the end of the dissociation. What does that mean? It means that our subjectivity continues. The core subjectivity in us, that impersonal sense of I, that's narrative-free, that was not born on that day, that doesn't have that name, that doesn't have that profession, it's not married to this or that person. No. Pure subjectivity. The subjectivity you would have if you were to become suddenly completely amnesic in a dark, silent room. Would there still be something left in experience? Yes. There would be no perceptions, there would be no memories, but there would be core subjectivity, that raw, undressed, unclothed sense of I-ness. That would persist, because that is universal consciousness. Dissociation only creates a different story because it limits the scope of our experiences and leads us to produce different narratives about the nature of the self. But core subjectivity is what is imbued in all nature. It's the same in me and in you. If you and I were in that dark and silent room and both of us became completely amnesic, for a little moment at least, we would both be essentially the same, because we would not have personal histories or different points of view to look at the physical world, you see? So it's a big difference. It's a big difference. And I mean, I wrote in, I think, chapter 8 of my book, Brief Peeks Beyond, I elaborated on a number of other things that render analytic idealism completely different than mainstream physicalism as far as its implications are concerned. The implications of analytic idealism are vastly different to those of mainstream physicalism. Another big example, analytic idealism recovers that dimension of depth and meaning that we have lost, because now what we call the 3D spatio-temporal world, the physical world around us, that is now not the whole story. That's a very thin layer of representation that is hiding, but suggesting at the same time, hiding from us, but suggesting to us an underlying world, the world as it is in itself, which is mental, and therefore it is entirely reasonable to say that world has meaning. Meaning is a mental phenomenon. So now suddenly, when you look around, you sense the mystery back. Because when you look around, all you see is the dashboard. You don't have a transparent window into the world. You only have the dashboard, and you begin to wonder what is on the other side of this dashboard. What is the substance, that which stands underneath that dashboard? The thing the dashboard is continuously measuring and observing and conveying information to us. What is that thing, that world as it is in itself, the thing that is measured, the noumena of Kant, the nosim of Fagin? What is that thing? The spirit world of Swedenborg. What is that thing? You know, that dimension of meaning is recovered, because now transcendence is not another realm. It's not something that, you know, you get to when you die. No, transcendence is right behind the dashboard. Transcendence is right behind the dashboard. It's right under your nose. No, that entire extra dimension of depth, mystery, and meaning is back. So the implications are vastly different. There is no such equivalence whatsoever. If you think there is, you have not understood either analytic idealism or mainstream physicalism, or perhaps both. Next one, the primacy of brain function. This is a delicate one. I mean, it's actually very simple, but it's delicate to explain. If you get caught by this objection and it resonates with you, it's tricky to try to pull you out of that hole. Once you're out of that hole, you go like, oh, of course! What was I thinking? But until I can pull you out of that hole, it is tricky. So let me try. Let me first explain the objection. We know that physical interference with the brain, such as, you know, getting knocked in the head or drinking alcohol, can influence one's inner life, conscious inner life, rather dramatically. Yeah, granted, sure, it happens. It would be naive or actually stupid to deny that. This indicates a narrow of causation pointing from a physical body outside consciousness to inner experience, which contradicts idealism. So, okay, the idea here is the following. If I physically punch you in the face, then as a consequence of that, you may feel groggy inside. You may feel dizzy, spaced out. Therefore, a physical action has caused a mental effect. That's the idea. And you see how seductive it is. And you know, why is it seductive? Because it's appealing to all those wrong intuitions that we inherit from our culture. It sounds so logical, this thing, because it appeals to all those hidden, unexamined intuitions that have been planted in our minds repeatedly by our parents, by our school teachers, by our doctors, by our bosses, you know, by our friends, the 8 o'clock news anchor. It appeals to all that. So what is the fallacy here? Well, the fallacy here is that it assumes substance dualism. It is assuming that there is a physical world and there is a mental world, and that physical actions are in the first world and mental effects are in the other world. But that's not what analytic idealism is saying. Remember, analytic idealism is monist. It says there is only the mental world. So when somebody comes and punches you in the face, that physical image, try to imagine that physical image. Somebody comes with a fist and punching somebody else in the face. Under analytic idealism, what is that image? What does that image mean? Well, that image is what is displayed on the dashboard of dials, on the screen of perception. It's a representation of a reality. But that reality is not the representation. The reality of what's happening is not a man with a fist punching another man in the face. That's the representation. That's the dials. That's what's appearing on the dials. All physicality. Let's take another example. A surgeon with a scalpel cutting into someone's brain. That will lead to big changes in someone's mental or in their life. So, you know, a physical action has led to, a physical cause has led to a mental effect, therefore physical world is primary. No. We have to be consistent with the premises of analytic idealism. There is no standalone physical world with a reality of its own. The picture of the surgeon with a scalpel is what appears on the dashboard of dials. The real event in the world as it is in itself is mental. The man with a fist punching somebody else is the representation of a mental event in the real world as it is in itself. A surgeon with a scalpel is a representation on the dashboard of dials of a mental event in the world as it is in itself. A body getting punched in the face, what is that body? We've seen it. That body is a representation on the dashboard of dials, on the screen of perception, of a mental process, namely a dissociative process in universal mind. So what is actually going on at all times are mental events. The surgeon with a scalpel is a representation of a mental event. Now, that mental event has a mental effect. If a surgeon cuts into my brain, yes, something would change in my conscious inner life. Does that mean that that mental effect was caused by a physical event, a physical cause? No, no, no. There is no physical cause. The physical world is a representation. The cause is also mental. The surgeon with a scalpel is the image of a transpersonal mental event that influences the mental goings-on in my altar. The man punching somebody, that image, that physical image, is a representation of what is in fact a mental event. Another altar in mind at large, in universal mind, configuring its boundaries in such a way that it looks like somebody punching. You see? Now, that a mental event has a mental effect is no surprise at all. Different mental processes are affecting one another all the time, even in your own dissociated mind. Your thoughts affect your emotions. You know, start having pessimistic thoughts and you feel bad. And your emotions affect your thoughts. Now, we talked about it. If you have relationship problems at home, those bad emotions will affect, your thoughts. Throughout the day, you may become more pessimistic, more cynical, more reactive, have less patience. So mental events affecting one another, mental events of the different kinds, different qualities affecting one another is trivial. It's trite. It's happening all the time. So when a man punches somebody else in the face, leading to a mental effect, that event, that cause was mental too under analytical idealism. A surgeon with a scalpel cutting into somebody's brain is a mental event. A mental event that presents itself on the screen of perception, on the dashboard of dials, as what we call a surgeon operating a scalpel. You see the point? So this entire objection is based on question begging and misunderstanding. But it is understandable at the same time because the hidden assumptions upon which the objection is based are so pervasive. They are so pervasive. We all have them. So it's a sort of an exercise in discipline to try to constantly make yourself aware of these unexamined assumptions. Keep on examining them. And then finally, at some point, you will overcome them and you will be able to see things more objectively without prejudice. And if you get to that point, you will see that this entire objection is one fallacy rolled up in another fallacy. The whole thing makes absolutely no sense. It presupposes substance dualism at the same time that it presupposes some form of mainstream physicalism. It rolls all of these unexamined assumptions into some kind of sandwich and then comes up with a completely nonsensical question. So keep this in mind. Analytic idealism is not a dualism. There is no physical world in and of itself with standalone reality under analytical idealism. All is mental. Even the events and the causes that we colloquially call physical, they are just the extrinsic appearances of inherently mental events. And that mental events impact and have an effect on other mental events is absolutely trivial. It's even the core of analytic idealism. All causation is mental under analytic idealism. So that one mental event has an effect on another, yeah, that's analytic idealism 101. Next one. The unconscious mentation objection. Well, there were these famous experiments done in mid-1980s by Libet, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, in which neuroscientists were able to measure a subject's brain activity, and the subject was instructed to decide, based on his own whim, when to press a button. So, upon deciding, the subject was supposed to immediately press the button, decide and press the button. And what turned out was that neuroscientists, by measuring the subject's brain activity, could predict, like half a second in advance, that the subject was going to press the button. In other words, the neuroscientists knew before the subject himself that the subject had already made a decision. And the idea behind this objection is that, well, if that's the case, then there is some non-conscious dynamics that has a causative effect on what appears in consciousness. That unconscious dynamics is actually what leads to a decision. So analytic idealism cannot be right, because under analytic idealism, everything is conscious. Well, yes, under analytic idealism, everything is phenomenally conscious, but not everything is necessarily meta-conscious. So, in this experiment, the subject would have to report making a decision by pressing the button. Now, for the subject to report making a decision, the decision would have to be meta-conscious. The subject would not only have to have the experience of deciding, but the subject would also have to know that the subject decided. Would have to know that the subject had the experience. We've talked about this ad nauseum in the previous part, in part 6. So all these experiments shows is that there is a delay between a decision in phenomenal consciousness until that decision percolates through to the field of self-reflective awareness and becomes meta-conscious. You see the point? It doesn't prove at all that anything happened outside consciousness, phenomenally speaking. Nothing happened outside phenomenal consciousness. What happened was that something that did happen in phenomenal consciousness had a delay until it came under the field of introspective awareness, introspective self-reflection, meta-consciousness, meta-cognitive awareness, whatever you want to call it. The field where the subject not only has the experience of deciding, but also knows that he or she has the experience of deciding. That's the point. Now, I am being very, charitable here in a technical sense. I'm interpreting this objection in the most positive way possible for the objector, because if I were to be really strict, I would point out to the fact that Libet's experiments, that the conclusion that was originally extracted from those experiments, in other words, that we have no phenomenally conscious free will, that conclusion has been debunked multiple times over. I will add a link to the description of this video to an article in which the journalist summarized all the different instances of debunking of that experiment. So I'll put it in the link. I'll put the link below in the description of this video. But even if I interpret this charitably, I would still say it proves nothing that contradicts analytic idealism at all. On the contrary, it reinforces analytic idealism, because under analytic idealism, it is expectable, it is predictable that a spontaneous decision happening in phenomenal consciousness would take some time to be re-represented according to a back and forth of information in the brain, as we've discussed in part 6. It would take some time for that re-representation and that closed loop of information transfer to actually take place such that the subject would become metacognitively aware, would know that he has made the decision and then press the button. This is what one would expect, because you cannot go from a spontaneous decision in phenomenal consciousness to a re-representation of that decision immediately. That's not how the brain works. The brain actually is quite slow as far as signal propagation is concerned, because it is an electrochemical machine. It's not purely electrical. So signal propagation is actually very slow. So to me, it's not surprising at all. I would expect even more than a half a second delay between a spontaneous decision in consciousness and a re-representation of that decision that then becomes introspectively accessible and reportable. All right, let's go to the next one. We're almost at the end of the course. The unconsciousness objection. If our body is the extrinsic appearance of our conscious inner life, and that is indeed what I put forward in analytic idealism, why doesn't the body disappear when we become unconscious during dreamless sleep, anesthesia, or syncope, in other words, when you pass out? Well, we've discussed all of this in part 6. We never become phenomenally unconscious. We know now from research in sleep, for instance, that even when a sleeping person is not dreaming, that person is having experiences of a different kind. This is very recent research, and very compelling as well, I would say, conclusive. We know that teenagers worldwide play that choking game, which basically is induced syncope. They pass out on purpose because although from the outside they look like they are unconscious because they are lying on the ground with their eyes closed and unresponsive, from the inside they are having a trip. And that's why they do that. It's tripping without drugs. and it's a very dangerous game. Again, I don't suggest that anybody, under any circumstances, play the choking game. I'm just using it as an example to show that associating syncope with unconsciousness it's debunked. It's not only old news, it's fake news. It is fake news. When we pass out, pilots undergoing acceleration training in a centrifuge and undergoing G-force-induced loss of consciousness, there was a study from 1990 in which the researchers realized that the pilots, when they are unconscious, seemingly unconscious, because blood is drained out of their heads in that centrifuge, they report, quote, memorable dreams. And I'm using the exact 2 words that have been reported in that paper. So when you apparently are passed out, you're actually having memorable dreams. And in anesthesia, we know of subliminal perception during anesthesia. We just don't remember those when we wake up because the chemical mix that you were given when you are given narcosis includes drugs that are supposed to prevent the formation of memory pathways. And look, all we can say about unconsciousness is that sometimes we don't remember being conscious. Sometimes we wake up in the morning and we don't remember our dreams, so we think we were unconscious all night, and then later in the day we remember that we had a very intense, rich dream. So, all you can say is that you don't remember a conscious experience during certain periods. You can never categorically say that you were unconscious, because memory plays into that. And these studies had sort of overcame that. For instance, the study on dreamless sleep, they had instrumented the subjects with an EEG cap, so they would know when the subjects are not dreaming. And then they would wake them up and immediately ask, were you aware of something? Were you thinking about something? Were you experiencing anything? So the subject would instantly say, yeah, no, I was having an experience. So the question was asked before those critical 3 to 5 seconds in which we tend to forget things after we wake up. Who doesn't have this experience of waking up in the morning and while you're still lying down in bed, you're thinking, wow, I had a major dream. And then when you sit on the bed and start putting your clothes on, poof, you forget what the dream was. You only remember that you had a dream. Later in the day, you may not even remember that you had a dream at all. So, no, there is no unconsciousness. That's what I put forward to you. There may be subtle phenomenal consciousness. There may be phenomenal consciousness that can't be remembered later on. There can be non-metacognitive phenomenal consciousness. In other words, phenomenal consciousness that doesn't entail meta-consciousness. These things there can be, but a complete absence of phenomenal consciousness, I would say, it never happens. And anesthesiologists are, I think, on my side. I will link to an essay published by a Dutch anesthesiologist on the Essentia Foundation website, in which he sort of suggests this. He suggests that phenomenal consciousness is kind of a very primary operating system, that it's always there, even when we think it is not. I will link that fascinating essay to the description of this video. All right, next one, we're almost there. That's the solipsism objection. You know, there are some people who hear my story and then say, well, it's nonsense because it's solipsistic. You know, scholars sometimes do that. And you know, I will limit the answer to this silly objection by saying, well, analytic idealism is not solipsism. Solipsism entails that you are the only consciousness that exists, that everybody else is just images in your own personal dream. Nobody else is conscious, the other people only existing so far as the picture you see on the screen of your perception. In other words, the whole of nature is your personal dream. There is no other consciousness. Well, analytic idealism, in a sense, is the precise opposite of that. Instead of saying that only you are conscious, it's saying the whole universe is conscious, including other people. Other people and the inanimate universe as a whole, they are all centers of consciousness, centers of awareness. The alters and mind at large. So under analytic idealism, from your perspective, I am conscious, and from my perspective, you are conscious, and my cats are conscious, and the amoeba and paramecium swimming on the lake, they are conscious too, and so are vegetables, and so is the inanimate universe as a whole. It's also conscious, because it's what's left of universal consciousness after you account for all the alters. And that thing that's left, in a sense, is a sort of host alter, a mega alter. And that's conscious too. So, yeah, no, analytic idealism is not solipsism. And if you think it is, you haven't understood one or the other or both. The cosmological history objection, that's probably the most ridiculous one, but this is the one that Jerry Coyne is on record using against me. So I sort of feel compelled to put my answer on the record as well. The objection goes as such, and I'm paraphrasing very closely to the words originally used, as per Jerry Coyne's written attack on analytic idealism. There is overwhelming evidence for the existence of the universe before conscious life arose. Therefore, it is untenable to say that the universe exists in consciousness. You see the silly way in which this objection begs the question. You know, consciousness is a product of complex life only under mainstream physicalism. Under analytic idealism, consciousness is all there is. So it was there from the beginning. Now, it is true that if there were no conscious life at some point in the universe, and we have every reason to believe that for a few billions of years, there was no conscious life in the universe. It seems to take some time for life to get started. Was there a universe then? Then I would say, well, yes. The universe as it is in itself, the world in itself, the thing in itself, a great universal thought, that was there. But there was no one to measure it from behind the dissociative boundary. So there was no physical universe in the sense that there was no representation of the real world on a dashboard of dials. But the thing in itself, which is all that matters, was there before life arose. Because the thing in itself is what there is. It is that one universal consciousness that was there from the beginning, because it is the one thing that really, really exists at the bottom level of the reduction chain, at the end of the reduction chain. All right, we've spent enough time on this silliness. So the next one, and it's the last one too, and it's a very subjective one, but I sympathize sometimes to the subjective intuition people have. They need some coaching sometimes to grasp the actual implications of what I'm saying. This is the implausibility of cosmic inner life objection, and the intuition here is as follows. When we look at a dog, we have every reason to believe the dog is conscious because the dog reacts, the dog behaves in a certain way. It's hungry, it wants food, it begs for attention. If it's suffering, you know that you have to get the dog to the vet because you see signs of that inner suffering in the way the dog behaves externally. So when it comes to living beings on the surface of this planet, we have these external cues to inner conscious life. The extrinsic appearance of these living beings, the way they behave on the screen of perception, on the dashboard of dials, in the physical universe, which is the dashboard of dials, that behavior as measured on the dashboard is suggestive of conscious inner life. Why? Because we know we behave the same way when we have certain feelings. We know that if we are feeling sad, we cry. So when we see other people crying, we think, oh, that's analogical to my behavior. So I intuit that that person is feeling sad from within as well. When we are in pain, we scream. So if our dog comes home and screaming, we think, oh, the dog is in pain. I need to take the dog to the vet. So it is this correspondence between our own behavior and the behavior of other living beings as they appear on the screen of perception and physical world, on the dashboard of dials, that gives us a clue that there is conscious inner life in other living beings. But when it comes to the broad universe as a whole, we don't have those cues. The universe doesn't look like it is in pain, doesn't look like it needs food, doesn't look like it needs attention. It's not crying, it's not screaming, you see. So is it plausible to think that it too, just like my dog or my cat, have conscious inner life? What is the wrong step in this chain of reasoning? Well, it's a very, very common wrong step. It's anthropomorphization. We anthropomorphize anything that we consider to be mental. But under analytic idealism, we are not allowed to do that because minds evolved on planet Earth are merely dissociated alters that have been shaped over 3.5 billion years by the pressures of natural selection. They have become reactive to their ecosystem, to their planetary ecosystem, in order to survive. You cannot say the same about mind at large, about the rest of universal mind that is not encompassed by alters living on the surface of planet Earth, on an irremarkable corner of an irremarkable galaxy. Universal consciousness, or mind at large, the parts of universal consciousness outside all biological alters, has undergone no pressures for survival. It's not an alter that had to maintain its dissociative boundary, that had to maintain its structural and dynamical integrity over the eons. It's just what is. So, of course, it's not going to behave the same way. It doesn't need to eat. It's not in pain. It doesn't need to announce its pain in order to get help from other living beings in their immediate social environment in a planetary ecosystem. It didn't have to evolve higher order mental functions to communicate and express meaning. It didn't have to do any of these things. That's part of the answer. Another part of the answer is the relativity of time. We may think that the universe is static if we look up to the night sky, and you will realize that the stars that were there when you were 5 years old tend to be the same stars that will be more or less at the same place in the sky if you look them up at the same time of the year, the same hour of the day. At the end of your life, the same stars will be there at the end of your life. It looks like nothing changed. And, a living being that didn't change would be a dead living being. It doesn't move, it doesn't react, it doesn't do anything. So we think the universe must be dead because it's always the same. But that's fallacious because that's just our intuition of time as living beings that have an average lifespan of about 80 years on the surface of planet Earth. We are mayflies in a cosmic scale. We don't live long enough for us to be able to accurately characterize our lives as the blink of an eye. The blink of an eye is much longer than our lives at a cosmic scale. Now, if you would look at a simulation of the behavior of the inanimate universe on a computer, and you would speed up that simulation such that we would see the changes the universe has undergone, how the universe has behaved over the course of its lifetime, over the course of 3.8 billion years, compressed in our lifetime, in 8 years, every day you would take a peek at that simulation, things would be very different. A lot of stuff would be happening all the time. The universe is alive, it's behaving, it's changing its configuration all the time. So some of the intuition behind this objection is just because of this fallacy of scale. For you to see the behavior of the universe enough to get a hint that, hey, this is a sign of inner conscious life, you would have to be looking at it sort of from an outside perspective, which we can only achieve through a simulation on a computer. And at a much sped up time scale, such that the changes would be clear to you. These are two half answers to this question. There are many other answers. There is no definitive answer in the sense that the question itself is kind of vague. It's subjective and intuitive. So there is nothing here to really pin down. The question itself doesn't ask for it. It's sort of a hand-waving question. So I tried to give a sort of a hand-waving but intuitively satisfying answer, hopefully. All right, this brings us to the end of this course. For me, it has been quite a marathon. I've been doing this for quite a while, planning the slides, planning the content, rereading the appropriate literature, recording these videos and having them be edited appropriately, publishing them. I hope this effort that we have made at Essentia Foundation has value to you. I hope it has helped you see the world around you and yourself in it through different lenses, hopefully more rational, reasonable, empirically substantiated lenses, less distorted by unexamined cultural assumptions, less distorted by culturally manufactured plausibility, which is completely divorced from reason now. And I hope that this also helps you find a new depth of meaning, a new depth of mystery in your life, because we are inserted bang in the middle of what is literally a cosmic mystery. We are living in a world of mystery that we cannot see directly. We do not have a transparent window into the world where we are right now. We only have a dashboard of dials, and that's all we have. We have to make the best of our dashboard of dials. And the way to make the best of it is to interpret what is on the dashboard, not literally, not flatly, not to think the dashboard is all there is. It's only these needles moving. No, no, no. You interpret the dashboard of dials as pointers, as indicators, pointers to something beyond themselves, pointers to a reality that is behind the dashboard of dials, a whole other dimension of meaning and mystery that the dials are indicating, they're measuring and pointing to. The right way to relate to life is to interpret the dials, is to ask yourself, what does this mean? What do the physical events around me, in other words, the needles on my dashboard of dials, are telling me about what actually is, about the world as it is in itself? This world, I have every reason to believe, is mental in nature. Not the same mind we do, a very different, unfathomable mind, but mental nonetheless. What is it, quote, thinking? What is it, quote, feeling? What is the point of life in relation to that mind? Because we are parts of it as well. We are dissociated alters of it. Why is it doing us? It doesn't need a deliberate reason. It's not a deliberate mind. It didn't plan us out. It's doing us spontaneously. But it is doing us. Where does the spontaneity of this doing come from? Where is it based on? What is the impetus behind it? The entirety of life is reinvested with a whole new dimension of depth and meaning. And I hope you can see it after this course, because that is my goal, is to help you see it. I'm not giving this to you. It's already yours. You're entitled to it from birth, merely by being for being part of the universe, for being part of what exists. I'm just trying to help you see it, because most of us are wearing not only shades, but dark glasses that do not allow us to see through them. So we miss out on this dimension of meaning, of mystery, of depth. And I'm trying to help you recover your ability to see it, because we are always immersed in it. That's where the roots of our being are. They are rooted. We are rooted in this extra dimension of depth, meaning, and mystery. It's only the narratives in our minds that block our view of it, our intuitive sense of it. If we didn't have this nihilistic, simplistic, metaphysical narratives that we have today, like mainstream materialism, we would be more exposed to our natural, spontaneous, intuitive sense of meaning and mystery, from which we have been divorced for quite a while now, certainly in the Western world, and probably in the whole world, because Western nihilism has sort of contaminated all humans on this planet, with very few honorable exceptions. So that's my hope for this course and for you. I hope it has also been enjoyable and fun. And you can expect more of this kind of thing from us at Essential Foundation. Our mission is to change the world one small step at a time. So stay tuned for more coming from us. Take care, and I will see you next time.